All right, so it's question time or debate time, as you prefer. I have plenty of questions myself, but I'm letting you ask first if you want. Elena?
Thank you very much. This is for Marcus, who is running. No, he doesn't want the question. So it's about the first inscription. I told you that is a distinction in the gifts between men and women. And sorry?
And children as well.
And children, yes, women and girls, I suppose married and unmarried or things like that. And I'm curious about if it's usual or why could be this distinction, if the gifts are the same for all of them.
Yeah. Should I speak to the... Yes, thank you. I think there are some other cases of this sort of distribution to children. It's not, but also starts to happen more in the 1st century BC onwards. So it's not completely unknown. But as to whether it, because you're all getting the same kinds of gifts, I mean, the amount of money when they give the money is a bit different. So there are some distinctions of status in that way. And also, I mean, at the end of the day, we have to, I think most likely these are exceptional cases, which is why they are being recorded. So it's not as if, you know, this is reflecting a widespread change in a more egalitarian view of society or something. So it's to show the benefactor's generosity in including these groups. I mean, I guess it's probably also another element of education, and they're trying to show that you know, that by including children and the youth, that they are kind of more or less sort of introducing them to that sort of part of civic life and incorporating them in that way as members of the polis. Yeah, I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but yeah. Yeah, but it's an interesting point, yeah.
Because in literary sources, the distinction is quite used for men and women, and it's but like that, giving gifts for me is new. I must say.
Yeah, I mean, actually, for me, I must say, when I saw that case too, I was quite struck that it is, because all the other ones I've found, you know, they're mainly just either the male citizens or just the councillors, you know. So to include the women as well and the children is quite exceptional, I think, actually. Yeah.
It doesn't appear, for instance, in the res geste anything like that.
No, he just says he uses in the Greek version. It's like Andres, like men, and or, you know, the people who receive the grain. So very generic terms that, yeah.
All right.
Not related with women. Is if there is the increasing habit of cash giving during imperial times, and I think you told something about that, but there were a specific place created or for that in the cities or where?
Well, I forget. Maybe there's one case where it specifies the place, maybe, but I can't remember. But presumably just in a public theater or something. I can't. Yeah, I don't know actually. Yeah.
I would have a small comment and 2 questions for you, Marcus, since we are focusing on your paper, if I may. What you said about cash distribution and being a Roman influence is very convincing, I think, because since we are dealing with change in inscriptions, as you very well showed, ariegetic distribution is not new in the early imperial period. What is new is the cash handouts. And what Pliny is saying when condemning the practice should not be understood as Pliny considering cash handout as not Roman. And if he condemns this, it is probably, I cannot remember exactly what the context of the letter of Pliny is, but isn't it related to cash handouts in favor of associations? Or it might be such a context, but in any case, what Pliny is condemning is it tries to avoid this kind of practice as being used as a way to corrupt, the local people. So we know that there are a Roman legislation which is de ambitu, which limits the kind of distribution in the context of the political campaign. So it's probably related to this. So it's not conflicting, I think, with your own interpretation.
Yes.
Can you remember the context?
Yeah, it's definitely about corruption. I think he more or less says that, as opposed to just giving gifts personally, where it's a friendly gift, this is giving gifts en masse, which
to groups. Yeah, so it's. I mean, Romans are perfectly fine with their distribution, but it's not in the context of the political campaign and any elections, or to mass distribution outside any reason or context.
Yes, so that's the context.
And my two questions would be on the economic interpretation of the phenomenon. So first question, so what you suggested about a possible link with the payment of taxes in cash is quite interesting. And so our first question would be, should we see that phenomenon as another proof of the total monetization of exchanges in Greek cities of that time? So this was probably the case already in an earlier period, but this would be another proof of the total overwhelming monetization of exchanges at the time. First question. And the other one is, I'm trying to think of what the interests of the benefactors were in giving coins, currency rather than meat and grain and sort of things. And I'm trying to say, it is a kind of calculation of the elite, since the value of the grain could be increased over time. The oath is a very common phenomenon in Greek cities in Asia Minor during the imperial period, where benefactors and landowners of estates are usually, and Dio of Prusa himself, are accused of retaining, keeping grain just in order to have the prices going higher and higher. So my question would be, to put it like this, is it cheaper for benefactors to give coins rather than grain? Because grain can be kept for month and month and just wait the right moment to sell it at a higher price. So this would be my two questions.
That's an interesting one, yeah. I mean, to answer the first one, I think for sure, yes, this must be some sign of monetization. I mean, obviously that's a huge topic, and I'm not really at the end of the day an expert on numismatics or something, and I'm sure many people would be much more qualified to discuss, that kind of phenomenon. I mean, at the basic level, from what I've seen so far, if you look at coin hoards in the pre-Roman period, the largest ones, even to the classical period, the largest ones are comprised of maybe 10,000, 20,000 coins. But in the Roman Empire, you have several that go into hundreds of thousands or millions even. Not millions, but hundreds of thousands. So that really shows, at least from point of view of scale, that is a big change. So when does that happen? It does seem to, I think, happen around this transitional period to the 1st century CE. So I think at one level, cash handouts must be a sort of sign of this being the case, really. Although at the end of the day, also the fact that they're actually only in silver currency, so not bronze, so that is also a high denomination. So maybe that also suggests that monetization is so prevalent that they're using silver as a special kind of form of gift. I don't know, but it must be, sort of monetization. The other question, I think that's a very interesting possibility about benefactors keeping grain longer so that they could, give money as a sort of cheaper alternative. I mean, one would have to do just a full study of the whole list. I've got about 100 plus cases, but most of the amounts are, not that large really of denarii. Maybe one would have to compare the price of grain or something. But as with economic history, it's difficult to say, whether. Although, I mean, I think most of the amounts say that they don't go beyond, like 10 denarii, 20 denarii. I mean, I think the highest is 80 or so, which is a lot of money, yes, but the fact that it's reasonably consistent over time would suggest that it does not necessarily reflect inflation or patterns in inflation. So, which would be an argument in your favor that, they're just giving out the cash because it's a sort of standard, it stays at the same value more or less, or has it's understood to stay at the same value. Although, of course, there's also the problem that in the Roman Empire, the coins do, the value of the silver does change, debase. So it's complicated, basically, but it's an interesting suggestion, yeah. Thanks, yeah.
Yes, if I may, what if I can, reference to your second question, I wonder then, because if people have money and they are able to give so much away, they probably have some source of that wealth, right? So they possess land, for example. So maybe that's some sort, even insurance policy, that we are giving away money which is losing in worth, for example, and we know that people will spend it for foods and so on. So maybe, and they will have to buy it from someone, right? And who is going to sell it to them? So the same person who is actually, giving the money away. So maybe some sort of circle which is, used for protecting your wealth, actually.
Yes, yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe that just came to me when I was listening to your question. So maybe I'm too very cynical. But knowing Romans as they are, I wouldn't be surprised if they were trying, to look for some insurance policy just to prevent the inflation, to reduce their possession.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a possibility too, I would say. Although one thing is that a lot of them are just given to counselors. So if you're just giving to the wealthy elite, it's not so much a patron relationship, but more to signify that they're special. Although it could be the case for when they include paroikoi and non-citizens too. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. I have 3 questions for each of you. I began with Marcus. Yeah, from a Western point of view, I would like you if you could take a look to the situation of change in the western part of the Mediterranean. In order to compare practices, rhythms, etc. Taking into account that in the Eastern there were a previous and strong tradition, and in the West there wasn't, except in the Greek cities, in the Greek colonies. Do you think that the historical process shared or had similarities, or were totally different between the cash distribution in the east part of the empire respect to the western part?
Right. Sorry, I might have misunderstood earlier on. Did you say about the...
Yeah, I said that in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, there were an important and strong previous tradition, okay? But in the west, there wasn't, except in the Greek colonies. And for this, I ask you if you could take a look to the situation, a global perspective, and do you think if could there were similarities or differences between the 2 parts of the empire?
Oh, yeah, I see. Sorry, I misunderstood.
No.
But yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know the Western material. I don't know the Western material very well, I must say, at all, except just a few references I looked at. but from what I understand, this practice of the public handouts, the Spatialis sort of thing, it's starting a bit later, apparently, in the West. The first cases are from the late 1st century CE, I think, or mainly in the 2nd century as well. So that could be a reflection, yeah, that because they did not have as much of a pre-existing tradition as in the East, that they're starting later. But then also, if they are, in a sense, more, as it were, I mean, I guess the general understanding of how kind of cultural change is happening in the West is that it's much more dominated by Rome, isn't it? And if that is the case, then it is interesting why it seems to start a bit later, if my argument is that they are kind of following the emperor. So I don't know, it's interesting, yeah, maybe because the emperor is doing it, so people who say the local elites in Italy, they might not feel like they should do it because the emperor's doing it. They're too close, maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
I mean, I'm going to do just some last remarks to Marcus, and I ask you to move on to the other speakers as well, because I have many questions for them too. Well, I mean, in Rome there are no caste, but food distributions from very early. I mean, the Atilius and some other magistrates do that from the 2nd or 3rd century BC, actually. So it's quite an established tradition already. What we don't have is an epigraphic record that transmits it. We only have the literary sources. But my question was whether the actual distribution of cash instead of food, and especially the perishable food like meat, isn't there a case to argue that this empowers to some degree the local citizens or the local population, because they could do whatever they want with that cash, in theory at least, because in practice they are probably just investing it in feeding their children with the food that is sold by the notables of the state. But anyway, I mean, isn't there a case to say, well, this is far more democratic, we have some more faith into the population?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is probably the ideological way, ideological underpinning of that. What the local notables would say to everyone else who's asking why they're giving out cash, right? So, but whether in practice it actually would have made them, give them more freedom, I mean, I don't know really, but I mean, for sure that, yeah, it it's going back to what Cedric was saying, it's about reflecting greater monetization. So there's more money available in the form of coins. So that would, it's just part of the general economy of that. I mean, also, we should not forget that probably exchange was also happening without coins, so you could still, purchase things without coins. It's not as if it would have been a sign of being much more, having much more freedom in that sense. So, but it's interesting, yeah. I don't know really. It's hard to say. Yeah.
Yeah, this is for Cedric.
Or we can maybe start with the
Okay.
paper of this morning, if you don't mind, because it's okay if everyone is thinking, and then we'll...
Okay, Peter. Yeah, I wonder why the number of inscriptions decreased after the Constitutio Antoniniana. And the situation with the cash distribution is the same. The maximum is previous to the Constitutio Antoniniana, and after that, decrease. Why?
Well, very, very good question. And is this especially good question because we see that these collapses after the not only Constitutio Antoniniana, but also generally in the 1st century, they differ. So they can, in Phoenicia, there's a decrease, but there are also regions where the decrease is not so significant, or maybe even did not occur as in general. We are operating on the very local scales of huge global phenomena. So maybe that's the coincidence. We cannot exclude that, I think. But I think that generally the first century is some sort of end of this period of prosperity, security, stability, and so on. And a lot of things changed in the cultural life, and also in terms of not only in the terms of economic life, but also in the cultural life. So in Phoenicia, inscribing was a long practice, but only periodically so extensive as it was during the Antonine era, for example. And we see that in the 1st century, right, it is still one of the most epigraphically focused century in Phoenicia in general. So the question is the 4th century, right? And there are very complex answers for your question. I don't think that I am the one who is going to provide the definite answer for that particular in that particular field, but I cooperate in the project which deals with this quantitative approach to epigraphic culture, and we are counting also other regions in the ancient Mediterranean, and hopefully someday soon we will be able to give a more detailed answer to your question. Thank you.
No, it's very interesting because we could hope becoming Romans, and these cities becoming Roman Municipia, these practices, these habits increase, not decrease. And it's true that the situation of the 3rd century is very, very complex, and maybe there are many issues to explain this process of this phenomenon. But I always think that the Constitution Antoniniana could have or could be a factor to lose the interest to become Roman, and the necessity to demonstrate my Romanization to become Roman disappear. But yeah, it's my opinion.
But very interesting. I'm very grateful for that remark. So I need to extend and to deepen my understanding of this social phenomena, and I will definitely have a closer look into the thing you are saying. Thank you.
Actually, I had a question for Marcus too, but it was exactly the same of Elena. So, Peter, my question is about inscription forestière. Do you know something about the archaeologist context? I mean, are the inscription only a mention of the imperial property, or, for example, would it be possible that they were included in the monumentum in the rural landscape?
Most likely they were just marking, stone. Not even stone. Sometimes they have shape of stones. They were put somewhere, but sometimes they also were rock cut. So it is mostly, it was not associated with any particular monument. So it's just a dysfunctional meaning.
Nowhere.
Yes, and actually, sometimes these inscriptions they differ. There's a series of these inscriptions actually, and sometimes they are marking particular kinds of trees that grow around, for example. So most likely it is purely functional. But it's interesting that in terms of epigraphic landscape. So I mean, the inscriptions, the ancient ones, actually, saw during going to I don't know, to the shop or visiting their grandmas or whatever. They, in the quite complex cultural, landscape, they had Latin text like this, on display. That was, quite interesting. And actually, we have this very close connection between the language, Latin language, and the imperial authority, right? So that's a very interesting phenomenon.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I have a couple of questions for Piotr too. Well, first of all, it was very interesting. Now, all of you, I'm not going to focus on anybody on that. But I mean, there are some sort of parallelisms in Sicily, in the Punic sphere of Sicily, for the Hellenism of that communities too, in the, let's say, late 3rd, 2nd century, broadly speaking, because obviously it's very difficult to date most of the inscriptions. So, well, that happens when Rome comes, but it's more or less, it happens at the same time as it happens in Phoenicia, so it's an interesting parallel. But my two questions are, well, first of all, you were addressing the fact that much of the juridic epigraphy could have been written in bronze, and that's obviously more difficult to arrive to our period because it's more easily reused, let's say. And you put the parallel of Cyprus. I mean, Cyprus is very rich in bronze, so it's very logical that they produce bronze epigraphy. I wonder, not as much whether this area of Phoenicia is rich in bronze or whether it's poor in marble, for instance, which would be the most logical stone to use for monumental epigraphy, because that happens in Sicily too. I mean, you don't have this marble, therefore you don't produce this kind of inscription so often. You have to import them. That's inconvenient. And yeah, the bronze was used, which was easier to import, really. And that was my first question, and well, I'll let you answer that.
Well, you're right, because basically the epigraphic culture was determined by the accessibility of decorative stone, for example, or other media, and we see the parallel that where we have very accessible bronze, for example, this phenomenon occurs in greater number, for example. But I'm thinking about bronze as an explanation why in so epigraphically rich region we have so little important inscriptions. Why it is so? We know that the decision-making process was recorded for Phoenician cities because, for example, one of the most elaborate, textually elaborate inscription devoted to the Phoenician community is the written what's the English word for that? It's a recording of the council session that the Tyrian councilman actually had, according one fiscal things and financial things of their, let's say, of their factorium in Puteoli, and we have that there's actually entire session recorded and inscribed in displayed. But of course, it was set up in Puteoli. So the epigraphic culture is while the city could actually act normally as a Greco-Roman city, the matter what was put in stone is some other issue, right? So yes, most likely the medium is of some importance here, and there's no marble. A lot of the inscriptions I showed you are actually inscribed in calcer. I don't know the English word.
Limestone.
Limestone, yes, of course. So that's, let's say, we can understand it as a desperate move, just to have something inscribed down. But since we do not have this bronze, we cannot say if that explains the lack of these public inscriptions. The literary texts, for example, they record the inscriptions like imperial Roman correspondence that were inside and Tyre and so on. But the question is, for example, does Josephus wrote it because that was true, or because he was this Romanized understanding how the official epigraphy should look like. So that's not very strong argument, in favor for bronze as an explanation of this. We cannot exclude that simply for the ideological matters, the Phoenician city-state simply did not record its decision-making process as the cities like Athens did, for example. It's a complex issue, really.
All right. My second question was on the 1st century BC, which would be a very, very interesting century because it's a transition century, and it appears to be there appears to be an impoverishment of epigraphic tradition, epigraphic culture in Phoenicia. Is there any reason for that, or
which century?
1st century BC.
Well, I think that I have my presumptions, but I'm still trying to verify them. We know that for example, the decline of the imperial power of the Seleucids and this power struggle in the Eastern Mediterranean had its social and political consequences. And we know about pirates, for example, and we know that there was a huge turmoil in the Levant, for example. There were some political system issues. For example, we hear about local dynasts and local tyrants that had their power established also in the cities, coastal cities. We know of tyrants of Tyre, for example, but we know them only from the literary evidence. I was trying to look for some other evidence we could possibly shape in similar form, which was the coin hoards, for example, displaying this, let's say where and when exactly the coin hoards were particularly, present. And we can distinguish two historical moments where the number of coin hoards in Levant rises significantly. The first one is dated to the very same date as the Alexander conquest, which is, the question is then, can we associate this explosion of coin hoards in the region with political events? So the war, turmoil, and so on, power struggle, has its consequences in people feeling that lack of stability and hoarding their wealth. And the second period of similar, let's say, intensification is the Maccabees War. So it is not 1st century BC; it's mainly the late 2nd century BC. But the question is, does it have its long-lasting consequences that not Maccabees wars in particular, but general lack of regional stability causes these quantitative effects? And I think that maybe to some extent we can associate that. But if that's the main reason for this decrease, I cannot tell at this moment.
I think that there were questions for Cedric too.
I will have, just if I may, but Elena, you wanted to?
No,
yeah.
I wanted to ask the question.
All right.
To you, so.
Okay, just if I may, just a couple of comments and questions. It's of course fascinating to use all this material and to try to make sense of big data. Well, big data in humanities, I mean. but still, it's very impressive. More than 2,600 inscriptions. Still, it's very impressive the work you've been doing on this. First of all, a quick follow-up, if I may, to David's questions about periodization. And I think we have to be aware, and I'm not attacking what you have been doing, of course. It's kind of thing that we all do, and trying to think about this according to the centuries. But what is the relevance of such a periodization? I would not be surprised to learn that most of the inscriptions dating from the 3rd century CE actually dates from the very beginning of the centuries. It's what we can see, for instance, everywhere in the Roman provinces. And for instance, Aitor Blanco Perez has been devoted a good share of works on 3rd century CE epigraphy from Asia Minor. And most of the times of Severan period is still part of the peak of the epigraphic production. And the massive drop usually dates from the 240s, 250s, and it has to do maybe to the long-term consequences of the Constitutio Antoniniana, even if I'm personally some doubts about it, but certainly it has to do with their. Are we still allowed to speak of crisis? I don't know, but what happened in the middle of the 3rd century, especially in the East? But I have 2 questions. The first question, and I'm sorry, I might have missed one information at the very beginning of your paper. Does all your inquiry include the inscriptions on small objects, instrumentum?
Well, it depends. Because my understanding of inscription excludes, for example, a certain number of these instrumenta. But for example, in terms of milestones, for example, which can be to some extent considered instrumentum, to some extent.
Because I perfectly understand that it will be another inquiry, all the more difficult that all these small artifacts are very badly and poorly or preserved and published, and it will make all the inquiry even more difficult. You would have, I don't know, many more thousands of items to take into account. Or hundreds, I don't know. But still, I think, I'm just saying it like, it would certainly be interesting for such an inquiry about the diffusion of languages and literacy, even if I perfectly understand what the point of your paper is, and to focus on public epigraphy, and which is very telling of a general process.
Well, thank you for these comments, actually, because that's exactly what you are saying. It's true that the 1st century is mainly dominated by inscriptions very early in the period. We need to remember that the demonstration of mass data according to intervals like this, like centuries and so on, is to some extent artificial, because depending on our methodology of presenting material, it will give different results to some extent, because in greater tendencies they are overlapping, and they are verifying themselves. They're verifying each other. But if we would try to put the same amount of data, the same objects in different intervals, for example, the 1/4 century, for example, we will see tendencies that are similar, but of course more, let's say, more detailed. But it will also mean that we have to include less material for such a representation, because not every item can be dated so precisely. And that's exactly what happens here. A lot of these 1st century inscriptions are from the first years, actually, of this, let's say, mature Severan period, of course. And also in defining what we take into account in doing this, of course, I had to make my decision why I'm excluding certain objects. And there is some amount of text on these instrumenta objects, of course, but very often they are difficult to trace according to their provenance, for example. And on the other hand, linguistically, they are not providing much attractive material. They are mostly Greek or less often Latin. So it is associated with this general global koine of this writing production, because I don't want to use epigraphically for not trying to confuse, right, what we are doing. So there's some of these objects in Greek, but for example, there are not so many Semitic ones.
I would have one more question. I don't know, Anthony, if we may, of these. You want us to move?
I would ask you to be quick, because I believe there are some questions for you as well.
Okay, so it's about the language diffusion and distribution, but I will keep that for the lunch, if you don't mind.
It was with, I don't know, I can, well, for the lunch, this one is about the periodization and constituent and the other was for Cedric, and so if I understand, the meaning of democratia is useless for Greeks during the imperial times, or not, it's not the same sense, it's losing its meaning. But it's because it's useless, or it's because it's controversial for the Romans.
Well, thank you. I think that the point, it's too controversial. I mean, because from a theoretical point of view, according to Aristotle's categories, you could, in theory, even use the word demokratia to describe the kind of regime the Greek cities were experiencing under the Roman imperial rule, even if the access to the council was limited to very wealthy people. As I very briefly mentioned, the demos were still part of the game. So, and the main reason why the term disappeared from the political discourse is probably because it was too controversial. I mean, it is Demokratia was understood as a revolutionary program, a project, and the elite were ready to admit that the people could have a share in the decision-making process, and that's the reason why I was making the difference between the democratic discourse and the civic discourse. The civic discourse is pervasive, and the elite themselves, in the decrees praising themselves during the distribution, we were talking about this thanks to Marcus' paper, the demos discourse is everywhere and is deliberately used by the elite themselves. And there was not an issue to talk about demos, to talk about politi, but democratia is something else. So it was controversial. Number one, and number two, this is not exactly, the term is not exactly fitting anymore the realities of Greek cities. But if I may just make another remark about the interestingly, oligarchy was not used either. Because in scholarship you would all very, very often find statements such as, during the late Hellenistic period, we had this talk yesterday with Marcus about the relevance of periodization and talking about late Hellenistic, what is late Hellenistic after all. But let's say from the 2nd century BC onwards, Greek cities are just oligarchies. That is not true. This is not true in reality, because those cities were not just a club of 10 or 12 people like classical oligarchies in the 5th or 4th century BCE, and oligarchy had, of course, a very pejorative connotation. So there's a reason why, and I think it's quite interesting to see is this coincidence or no. I think it might be an illustration of an Aristotelian influence or background. Politeia is the regime of the citizen, of the best citizen, of course.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to congratulate you for the theoretical and methodological background. And my question is a curiosity. Is there any evidence or is possible to reveal a possible discourse from the elite living in these free cities after the Constitutio Antoniniana? It's the discourse about the perception of their own regime change in respect the previous, or we know, for example, under the Republic times in Italy, there are Greek communities that refuse the Roman citizenship because it's probably they didn't want to lose their autonomy. What about this matter in the East part in the 2nd 3 century after Christ?
Well, there is no homogeneity in these regards. So even among cities enjoying the same status, you would see a great diversity and very different ways of negotiating for their city, their status with regard and relationship with the Roman Empire. And I briefly referred to Aphrodisias, because if you look at Aphrodisias and Rhodes, two free cities, they both have the same status, but their relationship, how they negotiate their status within the Roman Empire is completely different. I mean, Rhodes, it's very, Alain Bresson showed this, I find it very convincing that apparently Rhodians were very reluctant to get Roman citizenship. And even the one who got Roman citizenship, apparently, in the epigraphic evidence, were just named after their usual Greek personal name and did not mention their new gentilicium. This is Rhodes. And Aphrodisias, which is a free city as well, is completely different. We all know of Julius Zoilos, of course, and we all know of the Sebastians. So there is really a tendency to show off the loyalty towards the imperial authority in Aphrodisias. So it's really a matter of local agency. For what regards, I'm not losing your question about the transition and the consequences of the Constitutio Antoniniana. For what regards the democratic institutions, it's not, I think, coincidence that the very few cases where the very word democratia is still used in the Roman imperial period, or either in inscriptions, I mean, in official documents, or by orators, all these cases regard free cities. And this is related to what we were saying about the fact that democratia was too controversial for Romans. I'm not arguing that there was censorship and this was forbidden, and that a law was issued by imperial authorities saying you guys are not entitled, are not allowed anymore to speak of democracy. No, it's just the local elites did that because it was very beneficial for them to get rid of all that ideology. On the contrary, so those free cities very evidently had more institutions which still were democratic, or more democratic compared to the other cities. This was very convincingly showed by Julien Fournier, for instance. There was still a popular court in Rhodes, in Athens in the upper period. This is not the case in the other cities. To move to the question of the consequences of the Constitutio Antoniana. Unfortunately, most of the material, most of the evidence we can rely on to try to reconstruct what the institutions look like, how the civic life operated, most of the evidence dates from the 2nd century. So it's hard to say what's happened if those institutions were still democratic. Apparently, there is in the 3rd century. Apparently, there are some instances, some evidence from Rhodes that says that this is still what the case in the 3rd century, at least as far as the people serving as court. The only element I can say, let's have in mind the archive wall of Aphrodisias. You know, all the list of the archive, the copies of the correspondence exchanged with imperial authorities, proving the privileged status of Aphrodisias. All these inscriptions were carved in the 220s, 230s. The last document dates, if I remember well, of 250s. Another example, Thasos, which is quite interesting. A smaller city, of course, but a free city as well. And Julien Fournier, other French archaeologists working in Thasos, have shown that the tiny but free city of Thasos has kept graving and carving on the walls of the public buildings lists of their annual officials until the 240s, 250s. And this is the sign, I think, of a deep awareness by those free cities of their privileged status within the Roman Empire, including after the Constitutio Antoniniana, because we have to keep in mind that Constitutio Antoniniana did not affect the status, the collective status of local communities.
Cedric too. Well, the first one is on the evolution of the term democratia, of course, and how the traditional view of crisis during the Hellenistic period of democratia itself has been challenged and denounced as too ethnocentric, probably. So what are the instances of democratia before this period, so outside Athens, I mean, is democratia that different outside Athens before and afterwards? Or is democratia used very much as a synonym for autonomy and liberty and so on?
Well, it really depends on the period, actually. As far as the classical period is concerned, I think that Robinson wrote two very important books about democratia outside democracy. Before Athens was book number 1, and democracy outside Athens, book number 2. And I must say that in scholarship, these two very important books are underestimated, are really overlooked, because Robinson has very convincingly showed that contrary to what Athenians were claiming, contrary to what we are usually assuming, the first instances of a democratic government are not in Athens, but maybe in Chios, already in the 6th century BC. And there are many other democratic regimes. Of course, it's not the Athenian-style regime. This is first observation. Second observation, that over time, the influence, of course, of the Athenian conception of democracy was pervasive throughout the Greek world, especially in the 5th and 4th century BC. So democratia is used as a concept and to describe the regime, constitutional regime in the classical period. For the Hellenistic period, Jean-Louis Ferrari has already showed that, of course, and many others, and Dmitriev, the slogan of freedom, of liberty, that in the 2nd century BC, in the context of the intervention of Rome in the East, democratia basically mean autonomia, eleuteria, and you would always find the three most of the time. So it's kind of a triptych for cities for self-assertion and to show off their independence or their autonomy in comparison to the preeminent power of the Hellenistic kings. So there is something to be said, though, about the use of the non-use by the Roman Republic of those terms. Interesting, if you look closer at the documents, which are known through epigraphic evidence, or if you read Livy of Polybius, apparently the very first Roman officials being involved in the Greek East would use without any problem the two other terms, autonomia and eleuteria. Eleuteria, of course, was part of the Roman propaganda to try to convince their Greek allies that they just get rid of Philip V and Antiochus III, because the only thing they had in mind, because they just wanted the Greek to be free. And apparently they were very reluctant to use the word democratia. So what we were saying about the Romans being very reluctant, about democratia being controversial for Romans, it's not just the consequence of the emergence of authoritarian and monarchical. After all, the Roman Empire is a monarchy under Augustus, but already in the Roman Republic, because you can talk about the people, you can talk about res publica, but as we all very, very well know, the Roman elite, the senatorial elite already in the 2nd century BCE were at a very strong view against democratia.
Is more or less linked with my own presentation later, and it is on the growth of inequality, of economic inequality in particular, and how this affects the actual function of theoretically democratic system, when even though we don't have this kind of property limitations or qualifications, the reality is that fewer and fewer are able to, enroll into the political sphere, and therefore you have this kind of, the damos still exists in Sicily, for instance, but you have this feeling that everything is basically cooked in the bulla, and therefore, afterwards, just the damos, the assembly, just sanctions what the bulla is dictating, more or less. Do you have this vision as well, or do you think that the damos was more autonomous than it seems.
I would share this vision, but for a much later period, to be honest. So what I'm trying to do in my current, my forthcoming book, I'm trying to integrate also late antiquity, because this has to do, once again, with periodization, what's just to stop in the 280s. And I'm trying to do that especially because of the publication of a very important, but very controversial book of Anne-Valérie Pont, La fin de la cité grecque. And I'm a great admirer and a close friend, by the way, of Anne-Valérie Pont. I don't like this title. I prefer the subtitle, Métamorphose. Métamorphose. Changes, transformation, but it's not the end of the Greek city, and it's not the end of popular participation. And so, for just to be brief about that, for what regards their interaction, the interplay between Boulay and Ecclesia, we have convincing evidence from the 1st, 2nd century CE that it was just that the role of the people was not limited just to accept, to ratify decisions which were taken already beforehand by the Boulay. You know, it's kind of the problematic procedure. And this was shown even for Athens, for 4th century BC Athens. It's much more complicated than we might think. Even within a problematic procedure, you can have decisions, initiatives which were initially taken by the people, then the Boulay preparing a decree, and then back the people voting the decree. It's much more complicated than that. For what regards the 3rd century CE, what we were saying with about Piotr's paper, you have the last decrees, issued by Greek cities, dates from 240s to 50s. Out of that, massive drop and everything, and a big silence in the bibliographic evidence. But what we are saying about socio-economic tensions and inequality is definitely true for the 4th century, and this can 4th century. I'm sorry, and this can account, I think, for the fact that if you read Libanius, for instance, there is not a single mention and reference to ecclesia. The people is everywhere because you have to take as an elite. You cannot do without the people, but because the people were just a crowd, especially in 4th century Antioch, it's such a big city. But I don't think that in the 4th, let's say, by the mid-4th century, the people had retained institutional powers, even if in Sicily and Italy, and it's very astonishing to emphasize it, that you have dozens of these inscriptions which are erected by Ordo et Populus, especially in 4th century CE Italy. What does it mean? Was it a formal participation? I think that's we have many other evidence from Augustine and other texts and Christian authors, which points to an informal participation of the people at that time. People gathering, shouting through acclamations. But the interesting thing that even at that period, the elites considered useful to have the sanction of the people that way, since it's enhanced their own legitimization.
If there is not, we can just go ask questions or remarks during the lunch time.
No, just one thing. I don't know, maybe from the point of view of the epigraphy, of the richness of epigraphy, but if we look at the archaeological evidence here in northern Hispania, the problems, the lack of sustainability, and is appearing the middle of 2nd century CE, not with the Constitutio Antoniniana. So the cities became smaller, they are parva oppida, and that. So I don't know, is even if the epigraphy is rich, but the cities are not. I don't know if there is a possibility to relate the archaeological evidence with that, or because the Constituent Antoninian is far from these problems in the 2nd century. That in Hispania, I don't know in the East, but in Hispania they are evident. So, I don't know.
Yes, this topic was dealt in a research project directed by Javier Andreu, and the problem is that many Latin municipia begins to start in a decline or crisis phase previous the Constitution Antoniniana. And it's true that at least in Spain, in the western part of the empire, the material of the urban crisis precedes and is or happens after the Constitution. But I think this is only urban appearance, because the cities are working as previous, but with a pure urban appearance. Coming from the Rome.
The benefits of being Roman, they are not so clear, not because of Constitution Antoniniana, but before.
Yeah, I know.
Here, in the northern Spain,
Yeah.
this is completely
No.
different.
No. Moreover, in the onomastic dimension, in many cases, we don't look any change in the way to be named, no, in public. Continue the previous pre-Roman structure regarding the Roman. I don't know.
For lunch, because it will be very, very rich in discussion, I guess. Well, thank you very much to the attendants and to the speakers. And we have a second session in the afternoon after lunch.